All right, perfect. Good morning, Don
Morning.
Mateo. Buenos dias. How are you?
What's this? I'm good. I'm good.
That's good. It's good to hear. Your weekend, was it busy? Was it fun? Was it enjoyable?
Weekend was yeah. I had a lot going on. There was a lot. There's a lot.
All right.
A lot of moving parts.
All right, perfect. Today we proceed with chapter 15. And we are addressing section 3 of chapter 15. As I've mentioned before, the chapter 15 that I have has 150 pages. I think it's the largest number of pages for a chapter in the book that I have. So it's slow going. I just want to make sure that we get to each one of the points in the particular chapter so that we can extract, in keeping with Marxian logic, the most value, the most value from this book and from this chapter in particular. Okay, so again, the title of the chapter, of course, is Machinery and Modern Industry, and the title of section 3 is The Approximate Effects of Machinery on the Workman, okay, or on the work person, right? And just so you know, Mark, and I'm sorry, Matt, just so you know what the plan is, and so that the audience knows what the plan is, I'd like to highlight a couple cases, or rather a couple themes from this particular chapter. And I'd like to highlight the theme of women's employment as it is discussed in this chapter. And of course, correspondingly, children's employment as it is discussed in this chapter, because of course it receives special attention within a particular unit of this section. So I'd like to address that. And then of course I can't come across any attention to the subject of education in this book without being especially interested and especially excited, frankly, about reading anything that Marx has to say about the subject of education. As you know, Matt, and as some people out on Facebook land out there know, that I am a professor, and I'm a sociologist of education by trade, and of course I've been in the business of education one way or another since the mid '80s, and so the subject is very important to me, as you can imagine, and so any Marxian attention to the subject receives special consideration from me. So having said that, Matt, I'd like to begin, and I'd like to do so by reading some notes that I have here in my notepad for today's discussion, and to kind of set the stage, right? Drawing from the book, of course, and setting the stage for your thoughts and for audience's consideration and others' consideration. Again, I feel it's important that I share, number one, that this is the first time that I read chapter 15, right? I've read chunks of the book before, and I've read the book in segments, but never as we've been doing over the last 6 or 7 months. And this is the first time that I come across the language in chapter 15 as it is written there. And so having said that, I welcome and I look forward to receiving comments, questions, and even critique, especially, right? Because I might be missing something. So I welcome your feedback, Matt, and I welcome the feedback of folks that are following us. I really do. I think it's important that we engage in discussion this way. So having said that, I'd like to remind folks that Marx makes a distinction between work and labor. Work, as far as my understanding goes from this book, is an exercise of mind, body, and imagination whose end result, the product of humanity's engagement with the natural world, serves the immediate needs of those human beings who produce the particular product. It is an autonomous activity insofar as it takes place outside of overarching capitalist relations of production, right? So there's work, and then there's labor. In this case, labor is distinct given that it transpires in an altogether different historical epoch where the exercise of mind, body, and imagination exists within capitalist economic systems such that these capacities are sold in the labor market and are, in this case, a commodity, i.e. a cost to capital. And on account of the general relations of exploitation, this exercise, channeled as labor, generates commodities, i.e. use values, to consumers, right, from which an exchange value is pursued and drawn by those who employ those others who sell their labor power. And then I'll close with this before I ask for your commentary, Matt. Our discussion so far in chapter 15 is attentive to the nature and design of the pursuit of surplus labor and surplus value by way of the technological innovations and alterations in capitalist labor relations. To this point in chapter 15, we have examined the ontological and epistemological implications and even the physiological implications that the capitalist regimentation of human labor power has on societies. These are the notes to get us started. Your commentary, response, etc.
Well, you know, reading this chapter, I mean, it's very interesting because we've commented throughout the whole discourse that, you know, Marx uses this language of like, you know, and every man was thrown out of the workforce, and every man, you know, like to attend to his home, and this,
Yeah.
and he really writes about the rise of the factory, and the loss of like the cobblestone worker, the loss of the, you know, the one-stop shop, the craftsman. In a way, I mean, like, if there is the critique to be made, in a way that almost rings like, I mean, obviously it's devastating for someone's life. It's devastating for they're losing control over their lives. These are all very valid, you know, things to point out. But the way in which he writes about it, the tone in which he writes about it, always like kind of struck me as funny, because the way of life that would come to replace it became so normalized. It became like that was how people drew their identity from. So, but in a way, sometimes you write about it, almost seemed like emasculation or something. These men were being emasculated.
Yeah, I caught that.
Yeah, because they couldn't make their own carts anymore. Now they had to just make it the wheel. Like, you know, how demeaning, how, like, you know, he stole the man's essence, right?
Yeah.
And in this chapter, it really kind of comes through. And this is not to like chastise or whatever, but we really can kind of see when he starts talking about the women and the children working in the factories, like, and then women and children working in the factory. Oh my God, right?
Yeah.
But of course, he writes about it not like against the women and the children. He writes about it like in a very like, you know, like, this is terrible, and of course it is terrible. The conditions that women were working in, and the fact that children were working at all in factories is just, that's horrific. But he wrote about it, and really in many ways you could see like how you know, England at the time, which, you know, obviously was so much of the wealth of England that was coming into the factories of Manchester is still coming from, like, you know, its imperial, you know, machinations. I almost said like adventures, but no, it's not adventures. It's imperial conquests, right? But you know, funded by invasion. But at the same time, you know, everything people were facing was still, you know, really bad. But it was it's still within England itself, you know, somewhat homogenous, right? But still, the way to lower the wages for everyone, or the way to lower the wages for men, I should say, was by bringing women and children into the workforce because they were paying them much less, and they could argue for paying less. And what really struck me was, there was an act at the time to limit how many hours you could work a child, right? And it was like only
Yeah.
6 hour workday per child. And these people, these capitalists who were making a living off the labor of children, complained about this and said that essentially, like, if we can only work these children this much, the parents are going to go send them somewhere else to go work, and you're not helping the kids because now they're sending the kids out to go work 6 hours somewhere else. It's really really kind of reminds you of how people are today.
Yeah.
How those who own factories and whatnot act in our current world.
Yeah.
It's not new. It's not new. It's not new. For capitalists to want more and more and more and more and more. Is what I was on to say.
Yeah. There's a couple things that strike me about this theme, right? And of course, we're going to get into it as we proceed this morning. The first thing that strikes me is that there are notions of femininity that, and by femininity, of course, I don't mean, conventional interpretations of women as dainty, or of, women-based gender practices, right? As quote unquote dainty, as fragile, as and so on. That is, that there's this notion of womanhood, I suppose I should really say, right? That as you observe, and as I observed in what I was reading, Marx possesses, and I argue also that the capitalist class possesses in 19th century England. That is, that there is this conventional patriarchal, sexist, and misogynist understanding of the so-called weaker sex, right? The more exploitable. In fact, even the term docile is used in the reading in one of the footnotes, right? That the capitalist class has, and that on the basis of these assumptions, the capitalist class of 19th century England, and for that matter, the capitalist class of the 21st century, right, draws upon this understanding in order to pit women as workers, children as workers, against men as workers, men who are perceived to be more masculine, more virile, stronger, etc. So that's one subject that comes to my mind. I think there's another one, and I think that even Marx's own logic, as far as his recognition of the value, the equitable value and the equitable importance in society, the economic importance of those that Aristotle missed as inferior human beings, if human beings at all, right? That logic and critique that Marx directs at Aristotle might, in this case, also serve to understand Marx's misrecognition as far as his understandings, grounded as they were in his critique of capitalism, his understandings of women, and for that matter, of children. Marx, after all, is a man of his times. However much he possessed foresight and understanding about not just about the future and about the future of capitalism, but the trajectory from which capitalism is drawn. Right, Marx, of course, we know from reading biographies of Marx and of course his letters and such. We know that after all, he held on to conventional, even Victorian understandings of propriety and womanhood, and he drew upon them to figure in his relationship with even with his own daughters. Anything that you might want to say before we get into?
Well, I also think that Marx had this kind of romanticization of you know of handymen. I don't know how else to put it. He had a romanticization of like builders and people
Yeah.
that do this and that, and he like that guy can build his own house with his own hands, right?
Yeah.
And like if he had just gone out and done it more, I think he'd have less of a romanticization of it. If he like just like if you read about him, he like spending all his money on like piano lessons for his kids, and, like and his, he's doing all kinds of things. So I think if he just like had put his hands in the soil a little more, he might have had a little less.
Yeah. He spent too much time in the library, too much time in the ivory tower, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, like, and that's fine. I mean, I think that's what helped him. But I'm saying, well, the other part of it, the part that got him to romanticizing, is not really think about them more clearly, because the way he writes about like like the loss of this and the loss of that and the loss of this, and again it, like when you pair that with this, it really comes off like he's talking about like we've been stripped of our whatever. but scientifically though, reading this for like what is there to be read and gained and gained from as kind of a historical document or something to really think about in more modern times, recent times, is that he's writing about these things that theoretically, if we lived in a system that was taking care of everybody, and everybody had a say in the way things would go, and things were just getting better for everybody, the advance of technology would not result in the intensification of labor.
Yeah.
It would in fact result in the opposite, right? You know what I'm saying? So like, so what he writes about this advance of technology, these machines getting stronger and better and more capable and demanding less of the human, demanding less physical bicep strength of the human being in order to accomplish a set goal, right? But because it requires less bicep strength, more can be done, and therefore more will be demanded.
Yeah.
Right. So you live like, let's say, this pastoral system where you're subject to like the flu, like come and just kill everybody, or this can happen or that can happen. But the idea that you're going to be working 14, 15, 16 hours a day, that's absent. That's not part of your pastoral life, right? So you create this like other system, this pastoral, this system, and all of a sudden, there's an intensification of labor, including for those working in agriculture, right?
Yeah.
Before industry, there wasn't like these kind of work days. It wasn't this kind of like life. This was even under feudalism, even under this kind of thing where you're supposed to like kiss the rings of your betters or they might behead you. There wasn't 15-hour work days. I mean, no existed. So because there was no call for it. So the intensification of labor came with manufacturing and with the Industrial Revolution, and so that's something to think about. That sometimes the machines can come in and they should augment human life in a way that demands less of our physical bodies in order for us to survive the night, but instead create the conditions for us to be laboring where. And so where does that come from? Does that come from the machines themselves? No. It comes from the demands of the economy. It comes from the capital. It comes from capital. It comes from the ownership of property.
Yeah.
And the lack thereof. It comes from people who own property and people who don't, and people who don't must sell themselves to the people who do under this economic system.
Yeah. It's really interesting as we proceed in this chapter. On the one hand, one is under the assumption that the chapter is only about the incursions of capital in history on the factory floor, incursions by way of technology and machinery. What we're seeing in this chapter as we read is that much as one set of relations corresponds to another set of relations, that is, that one institutional context, one social context has a bearing on another social context, and that in fact these find themselves in a kind of dialectical relationship with each other. What Marx is doing in this chapter is he is shedding light on the tensions that exist between this institutional space called the family, the home, the house, and this other institutional space called the factory, right? And that capitalism has a way of bringing these two spheres together and then putting them in tension with one another. I think that that's a very important observation. I'm not a sociologist of the family, but as I understand from what I've read in that area, much consideration is given to this scholarship, Marx's and Engels' scholarship on the subject of the family, as it is impacted by history and capitalist relations within history. I want to now transition into the subject a little more specifically, and I'd like to draw attention to a particular quote here that serves as a kind of stepping stone for the discussion. And the quote reads, "If machinery be the most powerful means for increasing the productiveness of labor, i.e. for shortening the working time required in the production of a commodity, it becomes in the hands of capital," and here attention is drawn to something that you said earlier, "it becomes in the hands of capital the most powerful means in those industries first invaded by it for lengthening the workday beyond all bounds set by human nature. The automaton as capital, and because it is capital, is endowed in the person of the capitalist with the intelligence and will. It is therefore animated by the longing to reduce to a minimum the resistance offered by that repellent yet elastic nature barrier, man. This resistance is moreover lessened by the apparent lightness of machine work and by the more pliant and docile character of the women and children employed on it." Right? So that there's this notion of subservience, of docility, of weakness that certainly figures in the regard that capital has for workers, and recognizing that machinery and technology creates a redundant class of workers, the lumpen proletariat. Capital knows that then it can draw on even weaker sectors of society with which to produce its commodities for the market, and to do so in ever-increasing oppressive and exploitative manner, right? Such that one group, one sector of society serves as a barrier and as a buffer to exclude the more virile, the stronger workers in society who are prone to strike and to resist and to rebel, etc.
Right. I mean, if they were so virile and strong, how did they get themselves in this position in the first place? I mean, that's and I say that only within the context of these sexist attitudes. I would not say that outside this context, right?
Yes, of course.
Men find themselves in these conditions. They are completely outside the will. Completely, huge, ginormous historical forces are crushing them, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing inherent to them that is docile. It's the wave of history. It's the motion of these things that are just, they're massive and they will kill you if you don't participate, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So obviously they are prisoners of this condition, right? The men as well.
Yeah.
But so are the women. The women are not simply docile, and that's why they just like, I don't know what to do. And because it makes it sound like there's some inherent quality to them that and then the capitalists and their dastardly plans brought in the docile women to even emasculate us further and make us even less virile, right?
Yeah.
So that you know what I'm saying, when you think like that, it takes that. The fact of the matter is the women, the children, the men, all of them, all the workers are subject to this capitalist exploitation. And these attitudes, emerging from the men, and the position that they are in society, not just from the economic order, but from a number of the culture and institutions, and just the way that they were reared to perceive the world. A million different things, a million different threads, making them take these really hostile and patriarchal and counterproductive, ultimately, attitudes.
Reactionary.
Reactionary, and also reactionary, but also counterproductive towards what he's actually trying to write here, right? And so so these attitudes, they infect everything, and clearly, I don't like when people like try to take Marx and just say and therefore I found this thing that's wrong with him, and then so throw them over.
Right. Not
but he clearly got caught like a patriarchal fever here in this chapter, because his mind's not working properly on this question. At least with these adjectives describing docile and this and that. But that attitude is something that has to be combated in our own time. I mean, I think it's a great movie, Salt of the Earth, right? And Salt of the Earth, it doesn't at any point in time downplay the fact that there are these white miners who are getting the black lung and dying, right? No, they're there, but the Mexicans have it worse, right? Okay. And then within the Mexicans, at no point does it downplay the fact that the Mexicans have it worse, and everyone in the house is living worse than their white counterparts. But the guys are also very, very sexist, and it's counterproductive, and and the women, they have to do all this unsung labor, and they do all this work that just to support and bolster the family, just for these guys to come home and be like, rah, 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 right? At no point in telling that story does it downplay, the suffering of these men who are going to the mine, right? So that's the proper way to look at things, is to look at things without discounting all this other stuff. So I don't want to say this. I don't want to speak in a way that discounts what Marx is describing with these men working 12 hours a day, and there having to be an act in the parliament for them to only work 12 hours a day, and still the capitalists complain, and still the capitalists demand more, right? So I in critique of this other aspect, I don't want to deny the significance of what that meant and what he was writing about there. Nor do I want to lose scope of the historical text that he's delivering here, because he's talking about a time where there's a 12-hour workday. In his factory, he's talking about,
and that's a quote unquote victory for labor. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's a victory for labor. There'll only be a 12-hour workday, and he's writing about how these capitalists complaining that there's a 6-hour workday for children, right? And how that's not right, and blah blah blah. These kids, the capitals are saying that the parents will just lease them out, in that extra spare time. And you can imagine. I mean, you can just imagine being there. You can imagine there'd be fellow workers, right? And they'd be like, oh yeah, Bill just sends his kids out and blah blah blah, and that's not right. And it's bringing down my wages, and get that kid out of the factory. I mean, can you imagine being a kid in the factory, and you're a child, you're working in a factory, and there are people there who are hostile towards you because they rightly see you as someone that's lowering wages, but you're a child and they're an adult, and there's it's a horrific. It shows you really the terror of capital, and then people are still working, those type of hours.
Children are still working. Yeah.
Children are working. Yes.
Yeah. There's a few things that I want to mention before I take it to the next point of discussion. Is I can't help to read about this and not think, of course, of myself as a worker when I was, doing construction work with my dad for his employers. I can't help but think about my parents as children workers, in this case, children workers in Mexico. And perhaps in my mind, the most dramatic instance of a child labor in terms of my own family is the case of my grandfather, who before he was an adolescent was already literally digging himself into the earth in the mountains of northern Mexico, state of Durango and the state of Chihuahua, digging himself into the ground to extract rocks with minerals, rocks that he carried up a ladder, strapped to his forehead, right, and placed upon his back. And he shared with me, and now reading this chapter and just hearing you say what you've just said, and then thinking about how we've arrived at this moment, I really come to understand my grandfather's discussions with me before he passed away about 20 years ago, who shared with me that the older men were very vindictive and very mean to him. Certainly, they saw him as competition. Certainly, they saw him as, you know, a barrier to the kind of life that he could have, the kind of life, the better life that they were in pursuit. And certainly, given the language of this book and this particular chapter, my grandfather in the early 1900s, you know, this is even before, this is when he was a child, before the height of the Mexican Revolution. My grandfather was already an orphan. My grandfather was already an orphan. He was already hungry. And so he was willing to work literally for scraps, right? And the capitalist class in northern Mexico, the burgeoning capitalist class in northern Mexico, be that Mexican nationals or US nationals or Canadian nationals or British nationals, right, that were heading the mining industries of northern Mexico, knew this and played one sector of workers against another. And then there's a second thing that I'd like to mention as far as history is concerned, that those same children, for as deplorable and as terrible as it must have been to be a child soldier, those same children or children like them took up arms, right? And so it calls into question this notion of docility and subservience and control. They took up arms and they joined, you know, the guerrilla movement, the northern guerrilla movement, the movements of, you know, Pascual Orozco and of course Pancho Villa and others in the north, Francisco I. Madero, etc. And then of course also the folks down in southern Mexico, Emiliano Zapata. And the same kind of resistance, or rather I should say, at the same time, of course, children workers in the United States were organizing against capital. Of course, the famed story of the Newsies, right? The children newspaper vendors that organized and put the newspaper industry to a point of crisis, put the capitalist class in charge of the newspaper industry to that point of crisis. That's also a very important reality, evidence with which one might use to critique and at the very least, right, complicate notions of docility. The case of women workers, of course, is also, and the case of the Adelitas, of course, in Mexico at the same time, late 19th century, early 20th century, is also evidence of the fact that, you know, though men, be they capitalist or critics of capitalism, have patriarchal and misogynist and sexist notions of quote unquote femininity, right? Like Aristotle, some folks aren't, you know, attentive. And of course, aren't attentive because, of course, you know, the material circumstances, as far as Marx is concerned, don't facilitate this understanding and this perception, this epistemology, this ideology about the so-called weaker sex, about
Yeah.
children. Go ahead.
But I don't completely. I mean, like I see what you're saying, but like I think that like oftentimes we say all men are this or all this.
Yeah.
What it ends up doing is it ends up giving a free pass to people. I mean, it inversely gives a free pass. So everything's the same. Everything, nobody. You have to think like this, and you have to say that. I mean, like he could evolve beyond that.
Yeah.
And the fact, and you mentioned this. I mean, I wish I knew more about labor leaders, women labor leaders of the 1800s and 1900s throughout the world. I mean, I wish I did, but I you know, honestly, I don't.
Yeah.
But in this country, I know something about this country, and you know, like this is a country that, you know, like in terms of the labor struggle, owes a lot. I mean, like you're thinking about the Molly McGuires and the what do you call it, you know, you have Mother Jones, you have,
Yes,
I mean,
of course.
so many incredibly powerful labor leaders, and many of them are women. I mean, Emma. There was Emma Goldman, but I'm telling you, Emma Takuya, the pecan strike. I always mispronounce.
Oh yeah. I know what you're talking about. The name escapes me at the moment, but I know exactly what you're talking about. In fact, I was just thinking about the fact, you know, the 1930s labor strike in the Central Valley here in California, right? Was women played a very important, and in particular Chicanas, Mexican origin women played a very important role in that history. I'd like to.
You have Luisa Morena, you have Jovita, you have. I mean, there's just so many. This is case after case after case after case after case after case. It brought, you know, like there's so many cases. Family Hamer. I mean, there's so many cases in the past 2-3 centuries of organizing, you know, of women labor organizers that, you know, to reduce this kind of idea of docility is really kind of a silly kind of note. It belongs in the dustbin of history.
Yes. There's a tension, of course, between capital and labor, and in this case, since Marx brings it up, and since we're taking the subject to task, if you will, there's a divide, there's a tension, there's a dialectical relation between capital and then this particular sector of society called women, between capital and this other sector of society called children. And it's a dialectical relation, that is that, you know, at times one pulls in one direction and one is victorious, much as we might find ourselves in a tug of war, a historical tug of war, and at other times, right, capital has the advantage and pulls the rope in the opposite direction and in its own interest. And I was thinking about this, thinking about a way to address this, always attentive to history, but then also attentive, of course, to the victories of capital in the face of these sectors of society. And I thought about, and so I typed in my computer as I was preparing for this morning's discussion, I typed in the employment of women and children, and I came up with a couple things. One thing that I came up with was an article, and the name of the article is "More U.S. Child Workers Die in Agriculture Than in Any Other Industry. New U.S. government report highlights the dangers caused by weak child labor laws." The report, says this particular newspaper article, the report clearly shows that these gaps in laws designed to protect young workers leave child farm workers vulnerable to serious injuries and death. The report found that between 2003 and 2016, 237 children died while working in agriculture in the U.S. That represents more than half of the 452 work-related deaths among children in that period, even though child farm workers represent only an estimated 5.5% of working children. You know who the children are. By and large, we know who the children are. The report estimated that 4,700 injuries to children working on farms each year, based on data collected in 2012 and 2014. And then I'll close with this other quote. And this particular article is titled "Women and Minorities in Meat Packing." The most dangerous is an excerpt from the most dangerous job in America. In some American slaughterhouses, more than 3/4 of workers are not native English speakers. A new migrant industrial workforce now circulates through the meatpacking towns of the High Plains. A wage of $9.50 an hour seems incredible to men and women who come from rural areas in Mexico where the wages are $7 a day. These manual laborers, long accustomed to toiling in the fields, are good workers. They are also unlikely to complain or challenge authority. Again, of course, these are the assumptions, right, that the writer has about these particular right? To file lawsuits, to organize unions, and fight for their legal rights. They tend to be poor, vulnerable, and fearful. From the industry's point of view, they are ideal workers. Cheap.
Yeah.
Let me just finish this sentence. Cheap, largely interchangeable and disposable. Immigrant women are especially susceptible towards abuses. Go ahead.
All right. So the largest marches in American history, I think now are the women's marches, right?
Yeah.
But before that,
let me close my front door because there's a lot of noise outside. Give me 2 seconds, please. Go ahead. I'm so sorry.
Of course, like the women's marches are very, it's very bourgeois and it's very it was very organized. It's very kind of top-down kind of organization, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But it's still nonetheless that's the largest march. So I mean that system right there about docility. But the other largest march before that, the largest march in American history to take place in many towns was the marches of 2006.
Yeah, of course.
Right. So that's the largest march in American history, and it's certainly the largest march or the largest march up to that point in American history, and the largest march, and still to this day, the largest march that was labor-related in American history, right? The largest, with labor looming large over the event. So this idea that the undocumented in the United States of America, women, children, or anyone, are somehow docile. I mean, these are people who, in the fight for a number of things, screaming at Nancy Pelosi and getting shot. I mean, what I'm saying, these are this docility is. I mean, docile is such an ugly word, anyways. But being more low key, being more quiet, being adverse to confrontation, that's a personal quality, right? And then it appears all over the world in all kinds of different people, right? Being more aggressive and more pounding your fist on the table.
Yeah.
That's another kind of quality, right? And that appears in people all over the world. So the idea to attribute these individual characteristics to whole swaths and categories of people is not only in some cases sexist, some cases racist, some cases this, some cases that, bigoted. Let's just say as an umbrella term, right? It's not only bigoted; it's also used as a way to kind of it's a way to control people.
Yeah.
In the description of the world.
Yes.
Saying they are docile. So even if I'm advocating for them, they are docile.
Yeah.
It affirms again that they are docile, and it affirms my position as the one to point and say and I will fight for them because they are docile and can't fight for themselves.
Yeah.
It creates a category, a position for me, as a journalist, as a nonprofit leader, as a this, as a that. Their supposed docility, which the docility of this category of human being gives me a position in the world to operate because I am the one who speaks for their docility, right? Yeah. I'm the one who speaks for them who cannot speak for themselves, this sort of thing, right? But there is nothing docile about any group of people. There's nothing docile, but there's certainly in American history we've not seen docility from people in this country who are undocumented. We have not seen docility from women. We have not seen docility from children. We have not seen docility, and we certainly have not seen docility in this country from people who are of Mexican descent.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most rebellious sections of the population in American history.
Yeah.
Amongst the most rebellious, amongst the most likely to organize something, amongst the most likely to fight the power, amongst the most likely, it's one of the more likely groups to stage a protest, one of the more likely groups to, shout out with the cops, one of the more likely groups to be like shouting at a politician, one of the more likely groups to organize the workplace, one of the more likely groups, because one of the more likely groups to get paid less, one of the more likely groups to be working in unsafe conditions, one of the more likely groups to have reason to complain.
Yeah.
So that's why you find that. But I don't know.
Well, there's certainly a tradition of psychopathologizing, to use to use academic ease, right? That is reducing interpretations and understandings of people to notions about what their psychological inclinations are, what kind of people, what is their nature, what is their what is their personality, and so forth. Those kinds of understandings, of course, divorce human beings from understanding themselves as part of collectives, and as part of collectives, right, that figure in history and that confront, contest, converge, collaborate with other collectives in society. Of course, those kind of more sophisticated, historically cognizant understandings of humanity are very threatening to a capitalist class bent on dividing and fracturing human beings and normalizing the isolation that they experience, and that facilitates their exploitation and capital's generation of surplus labor and surplus value. Senor Mateo, damn, we haven't even gotten to the second subject that I'm like itching to talk about, and we have 6 or 7 minutes left. What I'd like to do is I'd like to spend as much time as possible on chapter 15, because I'm finding it very informative, and I think that we ought to give careful attention to its language. And so I'd like to table our discussion for next week about chapter 15 and the tail end of this particular section, section 3. There are other sections of chapter 15 that I also want to address. We have on my clock, we have about 6 or 7 minutes before we come to a close. And of course, your poem is likely not going to take that long. So I wonder if between now and your poem, we might address some comments. I don't know if any comments have appeared on your screen. I don't have the screen on my, I think I can figure it out now. Do you happen to have any commentary?
We're figuring it out. It was Emma Daniuka. That's her name. That's how you say it. Brought to us by Zahn. Econ Strike. Karina shares with us articles that more U.S. children workers die in agriculture than any other industry.
Yes.
And then also another article with the meatpacking industry has a long history of reliance on immigrant labor.
Yeah.
And it is important to remember that meatpacking is the most dangerous profession in the country. And recently there was an outbreak of coronavirus.
Right. That's right.
And so at 18% of the country, the quote unquote Latinos who compose 18% of the country were something like 54% of the coronavirus infections. So with the meatpacking.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
the meatpackers.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the national stats are. I know the national stats are grossly disproportionate.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah. And of course, I was recalling just a few days ago, sharing about it. As a matter of fact, I might have even mentioned it to you in one of our other talks. Uh, that I don't know if the folks that dismember chicken, I don't know if they're called meat packers. I suppose that they are. You might remember the case of the Tyson factory meat packers. Somewhere in the Midwest, about 10 years ago or so, is when I remember reading about it. Um, the conditions were so deplorable, and in fact, it was in this particular section of the industry, the workers were, by and large, Mexican women, and they were kept from moving away from the conveyor belt. They were kept from doing so and having an opportunity to go to the bathroom, and they were forced. And of course, this made the news, and I don't know what became of the matter, but of course, they were made to wear diapers.
yeah.
They were. I don't know if you remember that case.
I do.
Yeah. So there are notions that exist about workers, and there are notions that exist about particular workers, that figure in the tension and the syntheses that take place, if you will, at different moments of history. And these, of course, bear on the evolving and developing relations, economic relations and historical relations between and among different sectors of society. Let's bring our discussion to a close, unless you have something else that you'd like to mention.
No, I mean, it's like there's a no, there's nothing really else. I mean, like this weekend I had the honor of or the privilege or I don't know what it's called. I was able to interview the Green Party candidates.
Oh wow! Oh, that's right. I think I caught that, or rather, I caught the announcement of it. Yes, yes.
Presidential and vice
How'd that
president.
go?
So I would encourage people to check it out. It went really well. I actually asked them about a lot of the issues we were talking about with COVID in the meatpacking industry, and also with their view on charter schools, their view on private prisons, their view on detention centers, their view on ICE, their view on these different things. But as part of their party, it's part of their party platform. The Hawkins, not the party platform, but the campaign, this particular presidential campaign. It's part of the Hawkins Walker platform to honor the Treaty of Guadalupe.
Oh, wow.
So that's like kind of the difference. So, it's the Green Party's third party, but I think that I may have made history this Saturday, this weekend, because I may be the first time to ever interview a presidential candidate about the concept of honoring the Treaty of Guadalupe. I don't think that may have never happened before. Wow. So I may or may not have made history because more credit to them than me. I mean, because
yes.
They made it part of their platform. I mean, but like that was kind of like why I pursued the interview. So, but yeah, so we talked about a little bit about the Treaty of Guadalupe and its significance and.
You didn't mention this at the outset. Why not, Matt? You should have mentioned this at the outset when I asked about your weekend. This is very important stuff.
Because my life is an embarrassment of riches, and so all you haters out there, I want you to know 2021 is coming, and it's going to be even worse. And I will remember my friends and enemies alike, and I will respond in accordance. So, right, a poem, right? A poem.
All right. Okay. Very good. Well, will you bring poetic closure to?
Yeah. So this is a word on docility here. This is a short one, but it's near and dear to my heart. It's in the book. Where is it? I think it was. There. We don't pay dues. We start unions. We don't need a PR campaign. We are the people's movement. Revolution is an art. Let the streets be our canvas. And if justice is an arc, let this poem be known as a stone thrown to shatter it. Scatter the city planners, future of the wind. Make war on everyday genocide. Disturb the peace of empire. Permits? We don't need no stinking permits. In the hillside village, just steps away from my childhood home, the branches of a tree crumble a brick wall. If that doesn't tell you something.
All right, great, great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am the better for these conversations. I want to thank you. I appreciate it very much. I really do. This represents, you know, these last 6 or 7 months, slow as we've been doing it, represents the first time that I've read this book from cover to cover, or find myself in the process of doing so anyway. And so I want to thank the audience, folks that chime in from time to time. Your contribution is very important to me. I hope that in my humble, and I'm trying to be humble here by saying so, I hope that in my humble offering of my time, that I'm helping to cultivate and generate discussion on the subject of a book that whose language has very important insight for us. And anyway, I want to thank you all, of course, you as well, Matt and Karina, for the help also, especially, you know, helping to bring folks together. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
So long.
Farewell.
All right.
Get this.